Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we are jumping right into the absolute central tension of US-China tech relations in May of 2026. We're looking at how the biggest geopolitical actors in the world are trying to navigate some incredibly high-stakes corporate diplomacy. It's this fascinating moment where international alliances and corporate bottom lines are literally crashing into each other on the global stage. If you want to understand where global tech governance is heading, you absolutely have to understand the inherent contradictions built right into the structure of these mega deals.
Get this. On May 6th, the U.S. expands a massive anti-China tech alliance, officially welcoming Norway as the 15th signatory to the Pax Silica framework. Then, literally just 6 days later, an American delegation led by President Trump touches down in Beijing for bilateral negotiations with President Xi Jinping. I mean, this isn't just some weird scheduling quirk, right? This is the core analytical tension of this entire era in tech relations. How do you simultaneously build a massive wall alongside your allies and then immediately walk through the front door of the country you're building the wall against to make a business deal?
All right, let's get into Section 1, the roster and the ghost. Basically, who actually went on this trip and who stayed home.
Take a look at the heavy hitters on this trip. We are talking about the heads of a major memory semiconductor manufacturer, a leading wireless chip designer, a totally vital optical components producer, and the chief executive of the world's largest tech company. These industries are the ones taking the direct hits from export controls and the broader decoupling strategy. And these executives, they aren't just there to shake hands and take photos. They're actual principals in the policy disputes being negotiated. So you end up with this wild dynamic where the government officials writing U.S. tech policy and the private sector actors who are most financially exposed to that exact policy are sitting side by side at the diplomatic table.
But you know what's really fascinating here? It's the missing puzzle piece. Where on earth is the leader in advanced AI accelerator chips? I mean, this specific product is the absolute centerpiece of the entire US-China AI competition. In a delegation that is just packed with tech heavyweights, the single most consequential player in the artificial intelligence race is conspicuously nowhere to be found.
Yeah, that absence, absolutely not a scheduling conflict. It is a massive blinking neon sign aimed right at Beijing, and at all the observing allies too. It shows exactly where the administration is drawing a hard red line on negotiable technology. The very structure of this delegation communicates their negotiating priorities just as clearly as a formal position paper ever could. The executives who showed up represent commercial interests that the administration is actually willing to haggle over. The executive who stayed home represents a capability threshold that is 100% absolutely off the table.
Moving on to Section 2, the strategy collision, multilateral versus bilateral. So we really have to weigh two totally contrasting interpretations of what's happening here. On one side, you've got strategic sequencing. This is the generous take, right? The idea that the administration is carefully building a multi-track approach, trying to build an independent supply chain globally while managing the commercial transition with China to avoid a massive near-term economic shock. But then, on the flip side, you have strategic incoherence. Are we just creating a contradictory mess that actively undermines the overarching strategy? Because you're literally negotiating sensitive technology directly with the primary country your global alliance is trying to isolate.
To really grasp how deep this contradiction goes, we have to remind ourselves what Pax Silica actually is. The whole point of the framework is to build tech ecosystems completely away from Chinese-controlled nodes. It's a foundational commitment to securing sensitive tech. So making bilateral side-door commercial deals with China, deals involving the exact same executives running these sensitive technologies, is hugely paradoxical. If the U.S. starts handing out concessions on export controls during this Beijing trip, those concessions are going to apply to the exact same supply chains that Pax Silica is supposed to be locking down.
Which brings us to Section 3, the corporate intelligence risk.
The baseline assumption from the intelligence community for a trip like this is honestly pretty chilling. It is essentially treat all devices and communications as potentially compromised the second you step off the plane. You just cannot assume any meeting environment is secure. Now, these private executives are super used to operating in standard, safe corporate environments. But here, they are walking straight into a deeply monitored environment run by a state intelligence service that has a heavily documented interest in their specific sectors.
Just think about what these CEOs are carrying around with them, sometimes literally just in their heads or on a personal smartphone. We're talking corporate technology roadmaps, export control negotiating positions, the gritty details of supplier relationships, and massive investment strategies. These folks are prime intelligence collection targets. They're carrying some of the most commercially sensitive, non-classified information on the planet. To a well-resourced intelligence service, an executive looking to negotiate market access is just as valuable, if not way more valuable, than a government official carrying classified docs. And wow, this intelligence risk gets even crazier when you look at one of the proposed outcomes of the summit, a bilateral investment board. Think about what that actually means in practice. A formal institutional structure for private sector coordination is basically building a permanent, high-speed data highway for incredibly sensitive commercial information to flow back and forth across jurisdictions. Security architecture should absolutely be the main prerequisite before setting that up, but in the mad rush for corporate diplomacy, it so often becomes just a total afterthought.
Let's jump into Section 4, a shift in leverage, the power imbalance. The crucial point here is how the balance of power has completely shifted leading up to this summit, creating a really dangerous asymmetry. On one side, U.S. executives have massive commercial vulnerabilities. They are desperate to keep their customer revenue streams flowing, and they desperately need Chinese regulatory approvals just to keep their factories running. But on the other side, China has been actively deploying these really precise SWIFT tools, like those recent rare earth export restrictions that target specific industries with laser precision. Plus, they've actively reduced their reliance on U.S. trade over the years, all while maintaining the power to cause administrative disruptions without any need for a judicial process.
Because of that huge power imbalance, you get this massive structural misalignment of incentives. Think about it. The private actors sitting at that negotiating table have a strict fiduciary duty to their shareholders. Their ultimate goal has to be profit, revenue, and market access. But the national strategic objective? That's decoupling and security. When push comes to shove in a tense negotiation, there is a very real risk that these executives will prioritize their own corporate market access over the broader, overarching national strategy. It is incredibly tough for any bilateral trade framework to actually manage that inherent conflict of interest.
Finally, let's zoom out for Section 5, the world is watching. Allied fallout.
14. That's a really important number. That is the number of allied governments who had already signed on to the Pax Silica architecture before Norway just did. That's 14 nations who voluntarily aligned their own tech policies with the US. They accepted the serious commercial costs of decoupling, they accepted the diplomatic friction, and they did all of that based entirely on the promise of American consistency.
So imagine if the U.S. goes into Beijing and makes bilateral side deals that relax technology transfer conditions or modifies export controls just to help out its own megacorporations. That directly imposes costs on those 14 allies. It completely pulls the rug out from under the credibility of the entire multilateral governance framework. Because honestly, why would an allied country take a massive economic hit to isolate China if American tech giants are just going to fly to Beijing and cut a separate deal for themselves? This is an incredibly high-stakes institutional test of corporate diplomacy.
We're going to wrap up this explainer with a massive question for the future of global tech governance. As the whole world watches these corporate actors negotiate in Beijing, will this chase for near-term commercial interests actually unravel years of complex multilateral strategy? Can a nation seriously build a unified global wall while simultaneously sending its biggest companies to negotiate the price of the gate? It's a deep contradiction that's absolutely going to define the next decade of technology statecraft. Thank you so much for joining me, and I really encourage you to keep questioning how these massive geopolitical moves impact the technology we all rely on every single day.